It's really great to be here. This is a real treat. So I wanted to talk to you guys about supporting diversity and inclusion in the community. But I want to start with a little bit of context about the content that you're going to see today. So normally I give a lot of talks on technical topics, on systems for machine learning, on compilers, on computer architecture. And but I'm also super passionate about diversity and inclusion in the community. And about 6 months ago, I was invited to serve on a panel for a couple of the conferences, so CGO, PPOP, and HPCA. And I had 5 other panelists, and the 5 of us, were there to talk about diversity and inclusion. And the catch was we all were preparing, we all had pre-prepared content. And instead of it being more of an informal panel. And, when I started to think about, okay, what can I talk about that is not going to be completely duplicative of all of the other panelists and everything that they were going to say about all of the great things that, they're doing, or that we should do, or that the community, the things that have worked well. And so I thought about, how could I not be duplicative of that content? And I decided to sort of turn this around on its head and just cut straight to, here's all the things not to do. And I thought this is a little bit of a bold move, but we'll sort of see how it goes. And I sort of, framed the content as a bit of an homage to one of my co-presenters at the time, Dave Patterson. So he had this famous talk called How to Give a Bad Talk, and where he talked about all of the things you could do to really misdeliver a message. And so I decided to present what you're going to see here, which is, here's all the different ways that you can kind of go amiss when it comes to trying to be, supportive and provide a diverse community. So, and just a little bit of a disclaimer, I have no formal training in this topic. This is really just my thoughts and insights from being in the community for 25 years and some of the observations that I've made. So what I'm going to do is give you this clearly non-exhaustive list of things not to do. And I say non-exhaustive because I'm sure you're going to think of others, and I would love if you would share with me the other things that I missed, so that if I don't upset too many people with the content of this talk and I ever get invited to present again, then it'd be fantastic to make it a bit more exhaustive. Okay, so let's get started. I'm just going to dive right in, okay, with the first thing not to do if you're trying to support your community. And the one I wanted to start with was, avoiding or ignoring or speculating on data that you could just measure. Okay, so we've all seen this occur in lots of different ways. So I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. So one concrete example would be claims like, hey, women have never been interested in computing, right? So if that's true, you're going to have to let the 1980s know about that, because back then, women were receiving the highest percentage of computer science degrees that we've seen over time. So not necessarily true. So another example would be, hey, 10% of my colleagues or 10% of my community are women, and that's totally normal. Okay, so I'm here to burst that bubble. That is not normal at all. Pretty much any way you slice it. If you compare it with the degrees awarded, comparing against different companies, different research communities, nobody's at 10%, and that, that is normal. Okay. Another concrete example would be, hey, there's no way we have a retention or advancement problem when it comes to diverse individuals. You might be tempted to think that if you are not tracking these stats. You might be tempted to speculate why people left the community. But you know what? You can just ask people. I think people are pretty forthcoming about, why they chose to leave, whether they chose to leave. Those are things that are very easily measurable. Okay, and then one disclaimer I want to provide when it comes to data is it can be very tempting to take a single data point who happens to be in a very visible or powerful position and want to count them as more than one person, but let's make sure there's not any inflation on any of the numbers. So, a data point is a single data point. Okay, so, and in fact, this whole thing about data reminds me of this story of when I was at ISCA 2017 in Toronto. So this conference had a very unique setup where what they did was they had 50 talks over the span of 3 days, and they had everybody line up and give a 90-second like preview of little appetizer. Like, here's all the talks that you're going to see over the span of the entire conference. And so there's this whole line of 50 people. And I remember looking at that line and thinking, what? Something's I'm noticing something here. And the person next to me leaned over and said, 2. And I realized what she was referencing. And it was, there were 50 people in line, and there were 2 people who would be speaking who were women. And I was like, okay, that's easy math. That's 4%. What's going on? Is that normal? Is that expected? Is it this conference? Is it this community? What's happening, right? So all of us were like speculating and coming up with reasons why this was or wasn't normal. And then we all just agreed, hey, you know what? Let's just gather the data, okay? And so what came out of that data is a blog article that I published 4 years ago, together with Natalie Enright-Jerger. And we dug all into the data. Now, this data is not available anywhere. It is not procured for us. We literally had to look at the programs for 4 different computer architecture conferences over the span of several years and literally count the statistics, okay? We looked at paper authorship. We looked at who presented the talk, which we had to actually manually ask people. When the first author wasn't presenting the talk, we asked why. We looked at who was giving the keynotes at the conferences, who was on the steering committee of the conferences, who was on the program committee of the conferences. And, from there, we basically had tons of data. And we just said, you know what, we're going to put this out there. So we had graphs and graphs of, things that were, some of them were a little bit of alarming, right? There was one conference that hadn't had a female keynote speaker since the early 90s, which was actually before many of the people attending the conference were even born. So we were like, okay, there's some issues that probably need to be addressed. And part of me was a little bit heartbroken that we had to go do this manually, right? We were just like attendees at the conference and wanted to know what was going on. And so we dug back in. So if you're ever curious, I encourage you to take a peek at this blog article that caused a bit of a stink. We hoped that other people would follow suit and other communities would gather data, but I haven't seen too much of it. So, that's why I'm here. Please be data driven. Please focus on data. There's really no reason not to. Okay, so let's move on to anti-pattern number 2. And this kind of came out of, when we were digging into the data, what we saw was a bit of a discrepancy between the ways that the community was being inclusive, right? So when we went to the conference, there were plenty of women there. There were plenty of attendees, but it was but they weren't the speakers. And then, we were looking at, okay, there were plenty of women on the program committees, but they weren't the program chairs. or they weren't the keynote speakers, or they weren't the ones receiving the awards. So I wanted to distinguish, like, you want to have inclusion really all over the place, and not super focused on, putting people to work and having them in a service capacity, and having, a very diverse set of people reviewing the papers. Sure, it'd be much better if we had a diverse set of people writing the papers. Okay, so that's the thing that I wanted to point out. So that's like the community version of this point. But if you kind of look into different companies, different corporations, a similar related trend would be taking a close look at, here's all of the incoming, here's all the new hires and the diversity of that class, versus, hey, let's take a look. We just had a promotion cycle. Who's all getting promoted? Is that equivalent? What does the leadership bench look like? Is that as diverse as the incoming class? So that's anti-pattern number 2, confusing your inclusion strategies. Okay, so next one, this one happens all the time, okay? So there's a lot of talk about the pipeline, and it is a very, very important topic. The catch is, a lot of times I will see a discussion about the pipeline where the person doing the talking isn't focusing on the part of the pipeline that they're immediately responsible for, but they're focusing on the pipeline kind of outside of their jurisdiction. It's like whatever happened before the state that I'm in, right? So we don't have a lot of diversity in industry. Hey, this is all the fault of education, right? Let's blame academia on this. You go into academia, you go into grad school, why is there not diversity here? Oh, it's because of undergrad, right? Undergrad, why? Middle school, right? It just keeps going, right? And so what bothers me about this is that there is so much work to do in your own jurisdiction. There's so much you could do. There's so much you should be looking into. There's so much so many different ways you can help. It's sort of skirting responsibility to point to something earlier in the pipeline. Okay. Next, I don't know how many times or whether you guys have heard this. There probably is some good intent somewhere buried in these types of statements, but I've heard things like, hey, we want to increase the diversity of our community. And it's followed with, but we don't want to lower the bar. Okay. What do those things have to do with one another at all? Right. Pro tip, it is extremely offensive to say anything like that, to name any category of people and then follow it up with, but we don't want to lower the bar, right? Hey, I want to hire Princeton grads, but I don't want to lower the bar. Hey, I want to hire tall people, but I don't want to lower the bar. Like, where does it stop? So let's not do that. And here again, data is helpful. Data is our friend, right? Here's a fun fact. 70% of high school valedictorians over the past 10 years have been women. Okay, so we don't need any bars lowered. That's really not necessary. And if anything, kind of associating those two things, putting them in the same sentence really is a pretty strong indicator of unconscious bias. And hey, here's something you could do. Let's work on that instead. Okay. Okay. Number 5. Okay, so I don't know if you noticed, but the content of this talk, I dove right into here's what not to do. Normally what we do in like most diversity talks, they start off with, here's all the different reasons that diversity is important, okay? I hoped we were past that. I hoped everyone's done their research, everybody gets it, everybody has read all the articles that have been coming out for years and years and years. And we don't have to constantly defend that. And then particularly people in the affected class having to defend that, right? So I intentionally did not start this talk with why is this important, right? Because that's my anti-pattern number 5, is that I don't want to be expected to have to defend why diversity and inclusion is important and summarize 50 years worth of research into the matter. Okay. All right. So speaking of 50 years of research, I was on a hiring committee for a university this year, so as an external industry member. And I read hundreds of recommendation letters. And I hate that I have to have the slide. So there have been tons of research into the bias that can appear in recommendations. And not everybody got the memo, right? I distinctly remember being a faculty member in 2005 and getting this article that everyone handed out to all the faculty members, like, hey, heads up, make sure that you're not doing this in your recommendation letters. Make sure that you're not focusing on communal qualities when you're talking about women, like how they're helpful. And, as opposed to focusing on agentic qualities, like here's the, they have agency, they got things done, here's all the qualifications that they have. But you'd be surprised, like when I read through all of those, it's 2021, and I read through all of these recommendation letters and I thought, come on, like, aren't we past this? So that's why I included that as anti-pattern number 6, which is, hey, we can do much, much better when it comes to just recognizing all of the research that's been done into bias when it comes to recommending people. What are the good things to say and what are really more indicative of it's pretty clear what gender you're talking about here. In fact, they have a ton of tools these days that you can take a recommendation letter and send it through the tool. And it does like natural language processing. And it says, hey, you're probably talking about a female here, or you might consider removing this particular line. It has triggered associations. So things like this person's articulate, right? That is a pretty clear indication of racial bias, right? It sounds good. Who doesn't want to be articulate? It's just that tends to get called out for certain races above others. So that was anti-pattern number 6. And the next one's gonna throw you for a loop, okay? And so anti-pattern number 7 that I take issue with is the question of how can I help? This sounds terrible. I know you're all upset. Everybody's getting upset, like calm down. But I was at an event where we were talking, spent the whole day with people sharing their stories and, helping everybody understand the issues that everyone was facing. And at the end of that whole day, someone said, hey, how can I help? And I remember that like a few of us were like, what is it? Why does that bother us? And then one person put their finger on it. Okay. And so before I go into that, I'm going to just do a quick refresher on the steps of problem solving. Okay. So we're all like engineers, right? We love to solve problems. And what is always step 1 of problem solving, right? You want to understand the problem. You want to understand what are the parameters, what are the pain points, what problem concretely am I trying to solve here? Okay, that's step 1, right? And that's not an easy step. There's a lot of work involved. Step 2, let's come up with some ideas. Let's like plan things. Let's say, hey, I have this idea, but that one's not going to work. Or this one, I'm uniquely qualified to help. So that's a good idea. And then step 3 is you execute. Okay, you do whatever it is that you plan to do. If you get stuck, you like pivot, you re-steer, right? So this is the stages of problem solving. Okay, so here's the problem that eventually dawned on me, like what bothers me and others about asking how can you help. It's what it's really saying is, I don't want to understand the problem. I don't want to be involved in planning a solution and thinking of ways that I can help. I just want to jump in as the hero and do take things over the finish line. I just want to execute blindly. So that was anti-pattern number 7, which is really skipping the hard part, right? If we knew how to solve this, it'd be solved, right? We need more people and more ideas. And we need people like genuinely invested and really understanding what needs to be solved and how should we solve it. Okay, so I've given you 7 proven tips for undermining your diversity inclusion programs and your community. Number 1 was avoiding data or speculating where data is available. Right? That's not necessary. Let's just gather the data and focus on that. When it comes to that data, making sure that you're looking at the right pieces of data, making sure that you're like, hey, we've got tons of diversity when it comes to service roles. Do we have a diversity everywhere? Are we just measuring the incoming pipelines? Are we measuring people's trajectories? Number 3 is blaming the pipeline, right? The pipeline has issues, but let's all work to be constructive and solve the parts of the pipeline that we have the most power over, right? Rather than pointing to other parts of the pipeline that we don't have power over. Okay, asking why diversity matters is really, it's a bit too late for that. So like, hopefully we're all past that. Ignoring all of the data about bias in recommendation letters, like let's everybody do their research. And then finally, right, if all else, if we don't have anybody at the end of this event saying, hey, how can I help, right, that they actually have determined, here's what I'm going to do to help, and they just go do it, then, we have success here. So, okay, so that was all I had. And I'm happy to open things up for questions, suggestions, criticisms, any thoughts that you had here. And so I think Tanya will rejoin me and we can take any questions that happen to come.
Thank you, Kim, for that wonderful talk. So the first question that we have coming in is, and I hope that I'm getting this correct. So they say, on the subject of data, it feels perfectly reasonable to expect that people at this point in time understand the value of diversity. But does data support that?
This is, yeah, like, so basically, if what we need to do is give everybody a pop quiz, right? Like, if we just kind of go around and see, how many people actually get it. Yeah, this is a really excellent point. I am a huge super fan of whoever asked the question, because it seems we think similarly. That is a shortcut, right? So I'm assuming that the data does back the fact that everyone is already on board and gets it. And perhaps that's a bit presumptuous, and we do still have some work to do.
Great. Our next question is, have you observed more representation in the conferences you analyzed in gender diversity and computer architecture in the years since?
Oh, so we were going to do a 5-year retrospective. So it's been 4 years since we wrote the last blog article. And, it landed pretty strongly on the computer architecture community, right? And I think it was a bit of a wake-up call. A lot of people were thinking a lot about it. So I was curious. I was like, oh, we need to dig into that. But the thing that drives me crazy about it is, unless I do it, unless like Natalie and I do it, I think the data is not going to happen. So at some point, and I've set the 5-year mark, I was like, okay, 5 years is enough time to have thought about it, execute, put some things in motion, and then we'll see, are things better? I mean, I definitely see a lot of progress when it comes to keynote speakers and awards, but that's just anecdotal, right? This is just like, it seems like I'm seeing more, but yeah, we really need to collect the numbers.
Yeah, that'd be great. Sort of like how diversity numbers are being collected within corporations now too.
Right.
Okay, the next question I have is, what is a way for newcomers to dive in other than asking, how can I help?
That kind of asked how you can help. So yeah, I would say, like, really honestly think about it as a problem solving exercise. Like, think about it, take a look at what do you see as pain points, right? And pick one of them and say, like, I'm going to take this one on, right? I don't want to tell you which one it is, right? Because that whole operation of figuring out this is the one I want to take on, it's very personal. It's very like, this is going to be my thing. Right. So like, my thing in all of this was really just like data. Like, let's just be data driven about it. I'm tired of the speculation. But that was me, right? And that's just because I like to be data driven in general. What is it that you're passionate about? And how do you think you can apply that in order to, like, help the situation?
Great. We have another question. It says, I think this is in regards to diversity targets. So approaches to diversity targets for paper authors given blind review procedures. I think this is related to your point about having more diversity in leadership versus just in service.
Right.
Like, how can we increase, the diversity when there's blind reviews?
Yeah. So, well, like, what I don't want you to do is, like, actually have it be unblind and say, oh, we should, change our outcomes, right? That's not what we're going for here. It's really more like, is anything happening that is either discouraging people? Just like, there were 50-ish women at the ISCA where we noticed there were 2 speakers. Like, each one of them, hey, why didn't, like, are you on papers? If not, why not? Like, what, anything that's getting in your way there. The one we really tried to hone in on was for the women who were first authors, why didn't they present? Right. So there were 4 first author women papers in that lineup where there were only 2 women speaking. So we were like, what is going on? We only had 2 data points, but we dug in, and it was a technicality, right? This conference was in Toronto, and there were visa issues that prevented some of the first authors from actually presenting. So there wasn't anything like nefarious there, but, I think just understanding, like, is there anything getting in the way of more women on more papers?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It looks like we are out of time for your session. I really want to thank Kim for coming and talking to the LLVM community and giving this great keynote. So thank you so much.
Thank you.